Hello, and welcome again to another edition of the Book Review Blog. I am your book reviewer, and we're going to continue with where I left off with Skeleton Crew by finishing up the short stories that I hadn't covered in the rest of the book. So, going to where we left off, the next story that I'm going to do is called Beach World, and it's another one of those futuristic ones, science fiction stories, where two people are in a rocket and they're just flying through space and they crash onto a planet. And this planet has sand on it, like nothing else. And so the main person of this rocket is just one of them is like, okay, we've got to fix this. We've got to go and either find shelter or find some sort of water source, which he realizes that there is none, and we have to call for, and then eventually we have to call for help because we can't survive on this planet because all there is sand. The other fellow has just sat down on this beach and has said, nope, I'm just staying here. There's nothing else, and I'm just staying here. And so basically, the first guy is like, okay, you're nuts. You basically have entered insanity where you don't even want to get off this planet. And so eventually somebody does come and rescue them, or attempts to rescue them. And while they're being rescued, they're realizing that things from underneath the planet or underneath the beach are lifting up. They're describing like a hand, an arm is reaching up out of the sand, but there's like nothing but sand. And so these people realize, except for the man who just decides to sit there, that this planet is alive and they really have to get out of this planet quickly or else they're not ever going to live again. So they leave, and they leave the guy there, which is kind of funny. And I won't say what he does, but it's just kind of funny again. It was a very weird story for me, but there it is. The next story is called The Reaper's Image, and it focuses on a mirror that's been passed down in one family from generation to generation. And what happens is you can look at this mirror, and with some people, they just look and they see their reflection. But some people, when they look in this mirror, in the corner of it, they see like a black spot. And eventually what they see is they see the image of the Grim Reaper. And when these people who see this image, they'll go for some, like, it could be for like a day later or a couple days later or even like 30 minutes later, and then nobody sees them ever again. Nobody, like, they don't die and their body remains, they just don't see them. And so this person that's telling this story, he's telling it to another, like a nephew of his or somebody that he knows. And so these two people are looking at this mirror, and the person who's telling the story doesn't see anything, but the other guy does, or a second guy sees the black spot. And so he leaves to go do something, and this narrator of the story is saying, okay, I'm going to sit here and wait for this guy to come back. And that's where the book or the story ends. Essentially this man is never coming back, but you don't know how long this guy's going to sit and wait for this guy to come back. So again, whether 30 minutes, a day, 2 days, who knows. That's where that book ends. The next book is Nona, and this one is about a narrator. Again, there's a lot of books in this collection that are first person, which is nice. But there's a narrator who is runs away from college, or basically just drops out of college, and he becomes a hitchhiker. And he hitches into a town, and he stops at a truck stop, and he sees a woman who to him is very beautiful, and eventually, like, originally she doesn't give him kind of the light of day, but then eventually this guy gets into a fight with truckers, and so he gets into a fight and gets basically kicked out of this truck stop, and so the girl sees him and takes pity on him and is like, hi, I'll come with you and I'll kind of be your lover or girlfriend or whatever. But she always asks, do you love? And he's like, I guess, or sure. And so she's like, great, I know what we can do. And so she goes with him, and they go and they start to hitchhike, and they find a guy. They find a car to hitchhike, and they both get in the car, according to this narrator. They both get in the car, and the driver of this car, that he only talks to the man. Apparently, according to the narrator, Nona is talking to him, but this driver only sees our narrator. He doesn't see Nona. And but eventually Nona kind of gets into the narrator's head and gets him the idea to kill the driver, which he does, and they steal his car, and they drive out to, who knows, they drive on to the destination, and eventually they're stopped by the police, and eventually they kill the police. It's kind of like a really high-speed kind of Bonnie and Clyde type thing. But the twist is that everybody else, or everybody who sees the narrator, only sees the narrator. The narrator is the only one who sees Nona. And eventually Nona starts to change and become a different being. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to give you the spoiler for that. I want you to read this book again. So, anyway, the next story is for Owen. That's another one that's a poem, like Paranoid. But this is a nicer poem. Basically, it's like Stephen King is talking about taking his son, Owen, who is his real son, to a school. And they're having kind of a nice father-son conversation. And his son tells about what would happen if his school is run by fruit. Like, he has one teacher who's an apple. He has another teacher who's a lime, another teacher who's a watermelon, and, so on and so forth. It's a really cute little poem, and there's nothing scary about it. It's just really cute. So, anyway, the next story is called Survivor Type, and this one is quite gross, and I'll explain why. It's about a guy who is a doctor, and he is on a ship, and his thing is shipwrecked, and he's kind of an extraordinary doctor where he doesn't practice anymore because of who knows what, or they give reason in the book, but he's now become like a drug smuggler where this man is shipwrecked on an island, and he has no food. He has 2 pounds of cocaine, or of heroin, not cocaine. He has 2 pounds of heroin, and basically nothing else. And he has like a diary to write down his thoughts. It's a diary story. So the focus on the book is that he's stuck on this desert island. Nobody else survived the shipwreck, and he has no food. And so basically, after a couple of days, he is hungry, and like he kills birds, or whatever success he has killing birds, and he cooks them, but eventually he needs to be able to survive, and that's basically the whole question of how much do you want to survive, and what would you do in order to survive. And for him, he will do just about anything. And so basically, like, in pursuing a bird, he twists his ankle, so where he has to wrap his ankle, but his ankle is getting very swollen because, again, he has very little supplies to do this. And so he, with the aid of his heroin, he dulls himself so much where that he can cut off his ankle. And again, like I said, it's gross. Like, his ankle is so swollen that it needs to be amputated. And so he cuts it off. And then he's so hungry that he realizes that he can eat himself, basically self-cannibalism. I said it's gross. I'm sorry. Blame Mr. King. Anyway, that's basically kind of the premise of the story. And I mean, he lives, I'm trying to count how long he lives for about 2 weeks or maybe a month or so. I mean, his insanity and his lack of well-being goes out the door towards the end. But again, it's an interesting story. So the next story that I'm going to do is called Uncle Otto's Truck. And it's a story that, again, is told by a narrator. And he's talking about his Uncle Otto. And his Uncle Otto has basically kind of lost his marbles and lives in a one-room house. I mean, he doesn't have like a bathroom. He, I guess, has an outhouse or something like that. But his Uncle Otto once owned a business with this man, and part of their business was using this truck. And what had ended up happening was this truck had run over his Uncle Otto's business partner. And so Uncle Otto kind of, again, lost business and basically became a recluse in this one-room house. But his truck was always in the yard. And every time that this guy, or his Uncle Otto's nephew, would come and visit him, Uncle Otto would say, "My truck is getting closer. My truck is getting closer to my house." And every time this man would look out the window, his truck is in basically the same place as it ever was. So he's like, "You're crazy. What are you talking about?" But eventually, he does go back to his Uncle Otto's house, and his Uncle Otto has died. And he looks out the window. This narrator looks out the window above his Uncle Otto's, and he has realized that this truck has moved. And Uncle Otto doesn't drive this truck anymore, so the truck is moving on its own. And he asks, or basically assumes, that this truck has killed his Uncle Otto. Now, maybe this truck was inhibited by the ghost of this other guy who got run over by this car. I don't know. It's one of those mystery stories of why this happened in the first place. So, anyway, that's that book. The next two stories are kind of connected. Then it's all about, it's called Milkman, or there was another unwritten novel that Stephen King was going to do called The Milkman, but instead of writing this novel, he divided it up into two short stories. So anyway, the first story is called Morning Deliveries, and it's like, and in parentheses, it's Milkman #1, where it's basically about a man named Spike, and he is a milkman, and he goes from, on his route from house to house, and whatever order he gets, like say, the one house wants 2 glasses or 2 quarts of milk and something else. So he'll put the milk order in, but in one jug of milk, it'll be fine. But the next jug of milk will have something extra in it, like a poisonous gas, or like strychnine, or a spider, or something. And so, just as kind of a joke, and he does this to almost every house on his block. And again, it's a really short story. And then it kind of goes on to the next story, which is about a man named Rocky and a man named Leo. And in the first story, I should have said, Spike, all in his head, he's like, "I'm going to see my friend Rocky today." And Rocky works at the laundry. And so again, the next story, which is called Big Wheels, A Tale of the Laundry Game, or Milkman #2. So Rocky and Leo are people who work in a laundry. And they are just out of work, and Rocky needs to have tags put on his truck. And he needs to get them inspected. And Rocky and Leo have a case or 2 of beer between them, and they're just drinking. They're basically drinking and driving, and they're getting drunker and drunker and drunker. So eventually, they do find a guy whose name is Bob to go and get their the window sticker back on Rocky's truck. And so Bob is there, and he's drinking with Rocky and Leo, and again, they're getting drunker and drunker. And so Bob has the idea in his head that he's always not liked his wife and is like having an idea to kill her. And so eventually you know that Bob goes and kills his wife. Whether, again, it's by an effect of how much alcohol he had or what he was going to do in the first place. So Rocky and Leo are driving again, and again, they're very drunk. And so Leo happens to look in the rearview mirror and sees a milk truck next to them. And Rocky thinks that it's Spike, because what happened is that Spike is now, like, his girlfriend used to be Rocky's wife, and so Spike has Rocky's woman and Rocky's son or child. And so now they're thinking, oh my gosh, Spike is going to kill us. And so they speed, and again, when you drive drunk, it's not going to end well. So that's kind of where the book ends. And there's that. And then the next story is called Grandma, and it's a story about a boy named Georgie, and he's 11 years old, and his mother has left him alone in his house with his very sick grandma, because his mother has to go to the hospital to see Georgie's brother Buddy, because Buddy has broken his leg. And so Georgie is alone in this house with his grandmother, and his grandmother is sleeping. But Georgie is kind of scared of his grandma, because this isn't like a real sweet grandma who, will make cookies and all that. This is a grandma who's like really quickly deteriorating, and is just very scary. And so he recalls stories of how his grandmother had children, but they all died. And so finally she gets a hold of these books and starts reading these books, and then eventually she does have children who live. And what the author kind of learns or kind of realizes that these books that this grandma is reading are books of witchcraft. So his grandmother is studying like witchcraft and like Wiccan and things like that, but it's actually coming true. Like, if she wants to have a baby that lives, she'll have a baby that lives, and things like that. And so but it's very scary for Georgie's mother and Georgie's extended family, because they know what their mother is, and they want to stop it, but they can't kill her, basically, because it's mother, or their mother. So Georgie's grandmother eventually Georgie's grandmother eventually dies in bed while Georgie is there. And so Georgie has the idea to pull the sheet over her face and basically, and kind of bury the grandma, and wait till his mom comes home, or call the doctor and tell the doctor that his grandmother's died. But while he's doing that, all of a sudden his grandmother grabs his hand and grabs his wrist. And so finally he's like, oh my gosh, my grandmother isn't dead, or she's come back from the dead. And so things ensue, and basically there's like a whole bunch of witchcraft and spells and things like that. And poor Georgie, things do happen to him, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. So, anyway, that's it for that book. The next story is called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, and it's another narrator story, basically. And what it is somebody is telling a story about an editor is telling a story about an author client of his who wrote a story called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. And this editor is he wants it published, but the magazine that he published, or that he works for, has stopped doing fiction. And so he has to tell this man that his story cannot be published. But he's in kind of contact with this author whose name is Reginald Thorpe, and Reginald has an idea that that little beings, or little like fairies, are in his typewriter, and they're the ones that are typing this story for him. And he's like, well, I need to feed these beings. He calls the beings fornits, or fronits, and and when the beings or fronits are fed and they're happy, then they do fronis, which is like fairy dust, and again, it's a really weird story. And instead of like stopping Reginald and telling him that this isn't real, this editor kind of feeds Reginald's thoughts and says, "Oh yes, I have a Fornet in my computer too." And then eventually, this editor realizes that he does. He does have a little guy in his typewriter that tells him things and tells him about the Fornet in Reginald's computer. So, again, Reginald goes more and more crazy and just kind of utterly nuts. So, anyway, that's that story. The last story in this Skeleton Crew is called The Reach, and it's not a sad story, it's not a scary story, it's a very nice story. And what it is it focuses on a 95-year-old woman named Stella Flanders, and she's telling her great-grandchildren that this body of water called the Reach was getting used to be wider. And what she means is that they live on an island off of Maine, and all her life Stella has lived on this island. She's never been on the mainland. And one day when it's very cold, and the Reach has frozen over, so basically you can walk from Stella's island to the mainland. Stella sees her husband, who has been dead for, 20 years probably. She sees her husband standing on the Reach, and he's like, "Come on, Stella, come to me, come see me." And Stella goes out to him. And eventually Stella walks along the Reach to the mainland. And unfortunately, Stella ends up dying because it's, again, she's 95 and it's snowing and it's frozen. The Reach is frozen over, so it's very cold out. But it's not a scary story. It's not a sad, the only sad part is that Stella dies, but she's 95 and she's with her husband. So, it's again, kind of a nicer story. So anyway, that's the, book Skeleton Crew. I enjoyed it. Some stories more than others. I'm glad I read it. So the next story that I'm going to read is the Stephen King book, It. So, it's very thick, but I already started, so I'm happy about that. So I bid you all farewell and happy reading.